Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, filmmaker, comedian, child of the 80s.
Yeah, we all are, and that's why we've talked a lot about the 80s on this podcast, including in this season that we just concluded on the films of 1980. The year that Jason was born, the year that our producer David Rosen was born.
Don't give away my secrets.
The year that I was a very, very, very small child. So certainly the beginning of our long journeys towards cinephilia. Yeah, please stop.
I have a question for you. Since you dislike children so much, did you dislike yourself as a baby?
I dislike myself really for my entire life. You knew that was the answer that I was going to give. You're just setting me up there for that. So what we're doing now is we are looking back at our season, and as we generally do in this epilogue episode, taking a look at all the other movies that we did not talk about in our various categories, looking at some suggestions from our amazing listeners, and then taking a look ahead to what we have coming up. So we started this season with the box office champ, as we always do. And actually for this season, we talked about the movie that was number 2 at the box office, which was 9 to 5. The number 1 movie at the box office, of course, was The Empire Strikes Back. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that despite this being the epilogue, we are going to have an extra bonus episode coming up soon on The Empire Strikes Back, because you can't escape Star Wars. You got to talk about it.
You got to talk about it, Josh. And if we didn't, we would be doing a disservice to you, all of our loyal listeners.
So loyal. Other top movies at the box office include another movie that we did talk about, Stir Crazy, which was Dave's pick. Also Airplane and Any Which Way You Can, the Clint Eastwood monkey sequel to Any Which Way But Loose. Some weird phenomenon that has been kind of forgotten. Private Benjamin and Smokey and the Bandit 2, sequel to Jason's favorite film, Smokey and the Bandit.
Josh, you know who didn't forget the Clint Eastwood monkey movies was The Critic. They always used to poke fun at it. So.
Yeah. Have you seen those Clint Eastwood monkey movies?
No.
Neither have I, but I almost want to now.
Do you know what a monkey would say if it could talk?
I think I do, but you can just say it.
I'm a monkey.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. So many excellent jokes on this episode here. So,
Josh, for our first feature, we did a movie called Caddyshack by Harold Ramis, and I really deep dove it. I read a book on the making of it, and there's all the documentaries. And what was so important about that is, people love that movie, but really it was kind of between that and Animal House, just this kind of revolution of modernizing comedy at the time. So that was fun, but we had a lot of other good options, really great options for this year. Pedro Almodovar, who we have talked about before, his first movie, Pepe.
Pepe Lucy Bomb, I think that's only.
Pepe Lucy Bomb.
There you go.
Pepe Lucy
something
Bomb.
Like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Taylor Hackford, who we have mentioned because he's got a new movie coming out, The Idol Maker. One of them that I was going to suggest was Jim Jarmusch, Permanent Vacation, which certain people don't even consider as his first real feature, more of like kind of an experimental type thing, student type thing, but it's worth checking out. Your boy, Adrian Lyne, with Foxes, and then Mike Newell, The Awakening. And of course, Josh, we've talked about John Sayles before, The Return of the Sea Caucus 7. That would have been an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we hadn't already covered John Sayles, I would have really hoped for us to do that one, because that is a really good film and a big, sort of a template for a lot of other films, indie films that came later. So definitely a worthy film to check out. I think John Sayles, of course, is great. I was looking back in our discussions of what we were going to cover for this season, our emails back and forth, and our box office flop episode, we talked about Heaven's Gate. And as far as I can tell, at no time did any of us suggest any other options for that. I don't know what other box office flops there were in 1980, but Heaven's Gate is the flop of flops, and there was no chance of covering anything other than that.
Well, what was so interesting was, and again, I think I watched the documentary about that, and then, there are books on it, and it's like, we grew up thinking like, oh, Michael Cimino, the director who flew too close to the sun and blah, blah, blah. But they really never gave this thing a chance to get out of the gates, so to speak. So like everyone was at fault, and they really kneecapped this thing. So who knows if it would have been as much of a flop. It couldn't have been. It would have been a bigger hit just for being released, actually, right? So, and I'm glad that it has been reassessed, and I'm also glad that you hated it so much because it was so long and you had to watch it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting though that it has been reassessed, and critically, it has a fairly good reputation now. But still, I think the larger sense, like if you mention that movie to someone who's familiar with the history of film, it's like, oh yeah, that giant failure. It just will never lose that reputation.
Right. And the idea that it killed New Hollywood, which it didn't. It was just one of many pieces that did.
Yes.
For our Palme d'Or winner from the Cannes Film Festival, Josh, we went with All That Jazz, Bob Fosse, who I love. And the only other thing we were really looking at, because it was a tie that year, was Kagemusha by Akira Kurosawa, correct?
Yeah, that was actually a tie for the Palme d'Or. I mean, some other films that were in competition at Cannes included Being There by Hal Ashby, Samuel Fuller's The Big Red One, The Long Riders, which is a Western by Walter Hill, Out of the Blue, directed by Dennis Hopper, which recently got like a big re-release, I think had been kind of lost to obscurity, and I read a lot of good things about it, and a Jean-Luc Godard film called Every Man for Himself, and we've certainly talked about Godard in the past, but those were not the winners. Kagemusha, I think, came up a couple times, and we just, I think we didn't want to do 2 3-hour plus movies for this season. So we already had Heaven's Gate. We went with All That Jazz instead. And of course, Jason, as you say, I know you loved All That Jazz, and I didn't love it as much. And one thing we talked about in the All That Jazz episode was that I had not watched at the time Bob Fosse's film Lenny, about Lenny Bruce, starring Dustin Hoffman, which of course is referenced in All That Jazz as the fictionalized Bob Fosse character is working on a fictional version of that film. And given my sort of mixed response to All That Jazz, Jason was insistent that I watch Lenny.
I demanded it.
He demanded it, and I agreed, and I did watch Lenny, and it's very good. It's a good movie. You should check it out.
Whoa, how about that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect to not like it, and I didn't dislike All That Jazz. I just wasn't as wowed with it as you are and as many people are. And I like Lenny more. I feel like there's a bit more distance. The Lenny Bruce, at least as a character as represented in that film, is very similar to Bob Fosse or to the fictional version of Bob Fosse, Joe Gideon. But I feel like Fosse maybe has a slight distance because it's not about his own actual life and can be a little more critical of this guy who is really a kind of a crappy person, and showcase all of his flaws, as well as his artistic brilliance and how some of those flaws kind of led to his downfall. And it's an interestingly structured film with these sort of direct-to-camera interviews, which is a technique that a lot of biopics, I think, use later on. And maybe this was one of the first films to do that. So Dustin Hoffman, a great performance. I enjoyed it more than All That Jazz. So I liked it.
Fantastic. I'm happy to hear that, Josh. Before we move on from Cannes, I do want to, you rang my bell with Being There. I love that movie, and Peter Sellers is magnificent in it. Hal Ashby, such an important and unique director. So watch that if you haven't seen that one.
And I actually haven't. So that's certainly a movie I'd like to see.
I demand it, Josh.
And as we know, if you demand I watch a movie, it has to happen.
Josh, we went with, for our documentary pick, the Les Blanc film Garlic is as Good as 10 Mothers, which we all enjoyed. And we talked about all of the musical elements of that film. And we kind of referenced his movie, The Blues, according to Lightning Hopkins. And some of our other documentary picks, there was just a lot of music documentaries around this time. And some interesting ones dealing with punk music. Rude Boy, which is a strange rockumentary, unscripted type thing about The Clash, my second favorite band of all time, and the only band that matters, according to The Clash. But they've disowned that, so that would be really interesting. And then there's The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which has a big following, and that's about the end of the Sex Pistols, and that's told from their old manager's standpoint, Malcolm McLaren, who doesn't have such a lovely reputation, right? So those are some interesting pieces. The last one, Josh, is the No Nukes concert from Madison Square Garden that took place the year before, which, here it is. Boom, Bruce Springsteen headline, Josh. And I don't know if you know this, though. that concert, they just uncovered all the Springsteen footage, and they just released his version, his concert of it, like his set of it, and it's supposed to be pretty amazing.
Yeah, someday Jason will just do his own Bruce
awesome Springsteen year.
Yeah.
No, but Josh, this is relevant because No Nukes had all of the different people in it, and then they just released the Springsteen thing. I'll tell you one great quote from this. So Shaka Khan during the No Nukes tour, she ran off the stage because they thought the audience was booing her, but they were just Brucing her, because it's Madison Square Garden. They were all yelling Bruce. So they were all backstage. And they were telling the artists, like, hey, if you think the audience is booing you, don't worry about it. They're just yelling Bruce. And Tom Petty said, what's the difference?
Oh,
it's pretty funny. And Bonnie Raitt added, at least his name's not Melvin. So pretty funny stuff. I like it. I'm excited to see the Springsteen set, but I'm also glad we watched Garlic is as good as 10 Mothers.
Yeah, me too. I think that was a really great opportunity for us to delve into a bunch of Les Blank films. I know I enjoyed watching, I think, like 6 of his films, because a lot of them are very short. They're very easy to watch. And that was a cool kind of exploration for us. I think one other documentary that we mentioned, I don't know if it was me or you who had brought this up, the film Lightning Over Water, which is a Wim Wenders film about the director Nicholas Ray. And of course, we talked about a Wim Wenders documentary with Buena Vista Social Club. But that seems like it was, maybe another interesting exploration of a kind of a cult figure.
Who's Nicholas Ray? Tell us about him.
He's a director. I mean, he's mainly known for directing Rebel Without a Cause, but he was a Hollywood director in the 50s, but was also kind of a notoriously independent, kind of prickly figure who clashed with studios and stuff like that. So Rebel Without a Cause is his most famous film. They Live by Night, I think, is another film of his that I've seen. There's sort of a film noir movie. And I mean, he's a pretty famous director from obviously like a generation earlier than Wim Wenders. So it's their kind of collaboration between the two of them in that film.
Some pretty interesting documentaries of this year.
Yes, indeed. So after the documentary episode, we had my pick, which was Little Darlings. And I love that movie so much. I don't think I had really ever considered picking anything else. I was just looking through my top 10 list from 1980, a couple that stuck out to me as potentially interesting. Maybe we'll do a future Christmas episode about Christmas Evil, which to me is like one of the best Christmas horror movies, which I'm sure Jason would not appreciate. But I do love that movie starring Fiona Apple's dad. And speaking of people named Melvin, Jonathan Demme's Melvin and Howard, which is one of the great Las Vegas movies, and just a really entertaining, weird true life story. That I've seen a couple of times. That could have been a recommendation for me as well.
Mary Steenburgen won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar for that one.
Yeah, and Melvin Dumar, a distinctive Las Vegas character. And I've written so much about Las Vegas movies and seen so many bad ones. And that's one of the most interesting ones. But I was happy to pick Little Darlings.
Well, we're happy for you, Josh.
Thank you, Jason.
We always are. When it came to foreign film, there really, for me, was only the short list was Kagemusha, which we talked about, and The Last Metro, which we did. And I really love that film. What else were you considering for that, Josh?
I don't know that I was, again, looking at our discussion, those were really the only two that we had talked about. I was just kind of glancing through what else came out. Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears was the Oscar winner, which is not a film that I'm really familiar with. And the other really, really famous sort of classic film is Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, which was released in 1980 in the US. And that's certainly, it's a film that I've never seen that I really probably ought to see, and is a classic science fiction film. So that would have been interesting. But
that's on my list as well to see, Josh.
Yeah, and as well it should be. But The Last Metro was certainly an interesting way to talk about Francois Truffaut, and I liked it too. Maybe not quite as much as you did, but it was an enjoyable film.
I just was so impressed with the way he built that all basically one location, and the way he was able to utilize that location was great. It was a good movie. Speaking of good movies, you two dum-dums don't realize The Blues Brothers a good movie. And that was my pick for this year. The only other thing I was going to pick was Raging Bull. And Dave, on your pocket lining Patreon, I think we'll be talking about Raging Bull. So you can just keep on making money while Josh and I suffer.
Yeah. So in addition to Empire Strikes Back, we will have a bonus episode on Raging Bull. I mean, two of the biggest movies of 1980 that we felt like we really had to cover. So that stuff is still to come. And Jason loves Raging Bull, and I'm interested to revisit it because I think when I first saw it, I appreciated it as this important film, but didn't necessarily love it. So I'm curious to see how I feel about it going forward. We talked about the Venice Film Festival Golden Lion winner, Gloria by John Cassavetes, which we did not quite get on the wavelength of. We're not able to really appreciate Cassavetes so much. Dave did, but Jason and I, not so much. And that was Like at Cannes. That was actually a tie. The other film that tied for the Golden Lion was Atlantic City by Louis Malle, which I don't think any of us have seen. And, maybe would have been a more receptive reaction from us. Who knows? But a few other films in competition at Venice included Going in Style by Martin Brest.
That's a fun movie.
Yeah, it is a fun little movie. And he is, of course, one of the directors we've talked about multiple times. Melvin and Howard that I mentioned before. A couple of lesser known films by major directors, The Human Factor by Otto Preminger and Phobia by John Huston, neither of which are films that I'm familiar with, but certainly those are major directors. And The Empire Strikes Back actually played out of competition at the Venice Film Festival.
Josh, the best picture, there was only one, and that was Ordinary People. We've mentioned the other ones that were up for it: Coal Miner's Daughter, The Elephant Man, Raging Bull, and Tess. And it was interesting. I'm glad, obviously, we watched it. I had seen it before, but it was interesting to talk about, does it still belong? Would it be Best Picture if it was today? What, the importance of the movie then and its pros and cons.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, that list, it's like even Ordinary People maybe is slightly less of a classic or regarded as a classic now than it would have been. But it's a list of 4 like big movies and then Tess, which is a movie that I think has essentially been forgotten.
But Ordinary People is still highly regarded.
Yes, it is. So Dave's pick then followed. And what else did you think of picking and what did you pick for us, Dave?
Yeah, I picked Stir Crazy, which I was happy to revisit those guys and revisit some of their other movies as well. The number one other option that I was considering was The Jazz Singer, the Neil Diamond remake, which, would have been an interesting conversation, I'm sure. But I haven't seen it since I was a kid. The other ones I was thinking about were Airplane, of course, but, we've already done Zucker Brothers movies. The Shining, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it just seems like such a huge movie for this year. And then also I looked up the movie that was number one the weekend that I was born. And it's a movie called Hopscotch with Walter Matthau. And I watched it and it's actually really good. It was a lot of fun.
All right.
Thanks, Putz.
Hey, that's a pretty good impression there. I didn't expect to hear a Walter Matthau impression in this episode, but we got it. So.
What is Hopscotch about, Dave?
It's basically about a guy who's kind of like ousted from a spy agency. It's like not exactly the FBI or whatever, and he kind of starts making their life hell. And it's basically
like a fun Matthau way.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds great.
If I had known of this movie and was piecing it together when Burn After Reading came out, it would have easily been my first puzzle piece.
Wow, that's a high recommendation right there.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Josh, we had a lot of good choices for the future cult classic. I'll name a few and then you could take the rest. Cruising was the one we picked, and shout out to our friend Mike Pravat for all the knowledge he dropped in that episode. I know listeners really liked Mike in that episode. Which is more than I could say for you, Josh.
Thank you, Jason.
I'm just kidding, Josh. You're the glue. I don't know what you want me to say. You're good, Josh. How about that?
All right.
But we really like to talk about critical reassessments. We got that. We got Ordinary People. We got Heaven's Gate. What a year for critical reassessments. But what an interesting film Cruising was, William Friedkin. The real other one I was looking at was Where the Buffalo Roam, which was Bill Murray playing Hunter S. Thompson. And I know that movie is not supposed to be good at all, but I would like to see how it became a disaster. The other two that were on my list, Flash Gordon, we're talking about space operas, obviously, and Fatso with Dom DeLuise.
Yeah, which is, I think, is it the only film that Anne Bancroft directed, that Fatso? So kind of a weird artifact there. Looking back, we also mentioned a film. I don't know where this one came from, if it was from me or from you, called Die Laughing with Robbie Benson and a monkey, to bring up monkeys again.
Nice.
We almost could have done a whole monkey movie.
Yeah, awesome monkey
one.
year. Awesome monkey
What
year.
is that? What is that about? He just
I don't even know. I just looked it up when I was putting these notes together, and I was like, "Who suggested this movie?" I've never heard of it, but it was in our
sounds
emails.
awesome.
Yeah, I don't know. So there was that. And Jason, I think you brought up The Happy Hooker Goes Hollywood. So, which maybe is also a cult classic. We could have that's like the third Happy Hooker movie.
I mean, obviously it became a franchise, right?
Right. Well, I think it already was a franchise by that point. So, yeah, some interesting choices there. I don't know.
Yeah, Josh. And, for our Audience Choice Award, we did do horror movies. The Fog beat Friday the 13th and Maniac. And I'm glad we did that. We did have a lot of kind of cool ideas, comedy classics. We've already mentioned Blues Brothers. We covered Caddyshack, and Airplane was on there. I like the Dance Mania Redux because we've done a Dance Mania one, and this one had Xanadu, Can't Stop the Music, and Fame. So that would have been a lot of fun. And of course, we're in the 80s, so you have teen movies like The Blue Lagoon, Fox's Up the Academy, and The Hollywood Knights.
Yeah, I would have loved to do the Dance Mania, and I think we partially decided not to do that one because the last dance movie audience choice poll that we did was just a giant blowout. And so I think we saw there wasn't that much enthusiasm for all the different dance movies, but it would have been fun. I've seen Xanadu, which is utterly ridiculous and would have been enjoyable to talk about, and is also is a cult classic itself.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That could easily have been in the cult classic category.
Yeah, and Fame, of course, was an actual hit. And Can't Stop the Music, I think, is probably also terrible, it's like the Bee Gees movie, I believe, that they starred in. Isn't that what that is?
Josh, I don't agree with you on that one because me and my brothers did a great job. And I'll slice you up.
That was a terrible impression. You should go back to Walter Matthau.
That's a great Barry Gibb. I'll kill you.
All right.
Maybe I won't.
Please don't. As always, as we were beginning this season, we asked on social media what films from 1980 people were interested in or wanted to hear about. Certainly, there's a few of the big ones that kept coming up. Pete from the Middle Class Film Class podcast suggested The Shining, which a bunch of other people also mentioned The Shining, which is a major film. I'm always fascinated when people mention movies that I've never heard of. Ryan Ulbrich.
The Shining?
No, not The Shining. I'm getting on to something else.
But I real fast on The Shining, how we kind of... on our 10th season, we kind of looked at movies that we had maybe kind of passed on or didn't cover. I kind of feel like The Shining might be there if we do that again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, The Shining is a big one. And another one that came up from a lot of people was Airplane. Clint McCormick mentioned the Airplane. Tony Strauss, I think, mentioned it. Victoria Ribeiro, a bunch of our dedicated listeners, Jason Parker, all mentioned Airplane. So that's another one that we could get to. But what I was going to say, in addition to some movies that I am familiar with, Ryan Ulbrich suggested something called Galaxina, which I know nothing about, as well as Motel Hell, which is a horror movie. Robert Zemeckis' Used Cars and The Idolmaker, the Taylor Hackford film that we mentioned before. Somebody does like Clint Eastwood monkey movies. Clint McCormick suggested Any Which Way You Can, along with Flash Gordon, Friday the 13th, and Airplane. Kelly Stith suggested The Elephant Man, which was, again, one of the Best Picture nominees, another really, really big one. Victoria Ribeiro, who is always a dedicated listener, thank you, Victoria, suggested Robert Altman's Popeye, as well as Urban Cowboy, a film with John Travolta. Have you seen that film?
No, but those were both on my short list for us to cover as well.
Yeah, Popeye was kind of a flop at the time and is another interesting weird film. Oh, yeah. Chad Clinton Freeman, who of course has very interesting taste in films, he suggested Xanadu, as well as The Gods Must Be Crazy.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that. Hooray, Chad, because I thought it's such a unique, strange, like that would never be a hit today, right? Like that was one that I thought, and we did see stuff like that in the 80s, stuff like that, or Crocodile Dundee or Yahoo Serious, and like I think that's such a strange subgenre. I kind of wanted, it had a sequel, so I kind of wanted to cover that as well.
Yeah. So have you seen it?
I've seen parts of it, but I've never really sat down to watch it.
Yeah, I've never seen it, but it is a weird cultural artifact that was a big deal and now is mostly forgotten except by Chad. which you could say about a lot of films that Chad likes, probably.
Mm.
Adam Wells suggested Maniac, which I'm sure he voted for in our audience choice poll, but it did not win. Adam Hill suggested this movie that I looked up and I'm kind of fascinated with now, called Animal Olympics, which is an animated movie about animals. Dave is laughing. Have you seen this film, Dave?
No, but I love the title. That's great.
It's an animated movie, of course, about animals competing in sports competitions, but it has a bunch of like famous, like major comedy people like Gilda Radner doing the voices. And I was just looking at it on Letterboxd, and all of the reviews are like, this is so dirty and is not appropriate for children. And it's got all this weird humor, and it sounded fascinating.
Yeah, I remember the Laugh Olympics TV show where they had all the Hanna-Barbera characters compete against each other in Olympic style events. So that was probably inspirational to this, but putting it on the list.
Yeah, it sounds very strange. Tony Strauss, as always, sent us a massive list of every movie he could think of, including some no doubt weird cult films, The Ninth Configuration, City of the Living Dead, something called Bad Timing, A Sensual Obsession, which sounds pretty fascinating. Altered States, which is a big cult film as well, Inferno, The Watcher in the Woods, Forbidden Zone, and Cheech and Chong's next movie, which I feel like is probably a lesser Cheech and Chong film.
It was also on my list of things to cover because Cheech and Chong was its own, kind of cottage industry.
Don't worry. When we get to 78, I'm doing Up in Smoke. So.
All right. Yeah, I've never seen a Cheech and Chong film, although I wrote for years for a cannabis magazine here in Vegas about a lot of different stoner movies and stuff like that. But for some reason, I managed to avoid Cheech and Chong all that time. I don't know how that happened, really. So thank you again to everyone, all of the listeners, for your contributions. It's always fascinating to see what people want to hear about. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing about what we did talk about, and maybe eventually we will revisit 1980 at some point and get to some of these weird films, or we'll just all have a party and watch Animal Olympics together.
Yes.
I know you like hanging out with people, Josh.
I do not. So, Jason, well, first of all, of course, we're getting to our bonus episodes. As we said, The Empire Strikes Back and Raging Bull, those are going to come out soon. Sign up for the Patreon, the Produced by David Rosen Patreon, to check out the Raging Bull episode, and we'll have The Empire Strikes Back out on our regular feed for everyone because Star Wars is for the people. But once we do that, Jason, do you want to tell us what are we covering in our next season?
I do want to tell you, Josh, because as we've all said, we're really excited. I think coming up this season is maybe the most excitement we've had for a season. When we planned this out, we were like, whoa, what a good year. What an awesome movie year. And that awesome movie year is 1992.
Yeah, a big year, I think, for the sort of the development of the indie film scene, and the whole Sundance phenomenon is something that we've talked about in a few of our 90s seasons. And this is going to be a big year for that as well. But a lot of interesting different films. We will start it off in a few weeks after we get our bonus episodes out. We'll start it off with the box office champion, which is not a Sundance film at all. It is Disney's Aladdin, but we will get to that. So tune in soon for that. And before you do, make sure to check us out on social media. Give us all your suggestions.
Check us out, baby. Give me suggestions at Jason Harris Comedy on Facebook and Instagram, J Harris Comedy on Twitter. I think I'm Jason Harris or J Harris on all of them, actually. My website, Go For Jason, was developed in 1992 and hasn't changed since, but it might soon. AwesomeMovieYear.com. That one's okay. Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram. Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter.
You can find some stuff at JoshBellHatesEverything.com, also at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook, and at Signal Bleed on Twitter. And you can listen to our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media at Piecing Pod, and join our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces, where all those great recommendations kept coming from.
Yes, thank you again for those recommendations. We look forward to hearing more from you about this season, and we'll, I'm sure, soon be hearing your suggestions for 1992.
And Dave, am I correct? You told us this was easily our most downloaded season.
Absolutely, yeah. Lots of new listeners this season, and I'm excited to see how they follow us into these new years.
So thank you all for listening, for giving us feedback, and for continuing to support. We really appreciate you.
We do. So tune in soon for our 1992 season, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.